As General Yoshijirō Umezu carefully studies the papers on his desk, his brow begins to furrow. The General Staff of the Imperial Japanese Navy have presented him with a proposal that he can barely believe. His eyes dart up and down the pages as he takes in the incredible details. The largest submarines ever built, specially built aircraft on a one-way mission to the west coast of the United States, a weapon potentially more lethal than any conventional bomb. Suddenly, he spots an all-too-familiar name, Lieutenant General Shirō Ishii, director of the infamous Unit 731, the man whose twisted mind has already birthed some of the war's worst atrocities in China. Now, it seems he's on board with the Navy for this shocking new scheme, one that promises to infect this modern war with a medieval monster. Umezu slowly looks up as he lays the documents down. If he allows this to go ahead, it could turn Japan's failing fortunes around, maybe even win them the war. But with implications going far beyond this conflict, the world may never forgive them. Background. The seeds of Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night were sown in 1944, as Japan's military situation began looking increasingly difficult with each passing day. After the initial success of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and the subsequent expansion of territory that saw them take several strategic points, including the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma, the Japanese now found themselves on the back foot. Allied forces were island-hopping their way across the Pacific at an alarming rate, getting closer and closer to the Japanese home islands. With what remained of its battered fleet in retreat and conventional options dwindling, the Imperial Japanese Navy began exploring more radical measures, vowing to hit the American enemy where it would hurt them the most, on their own soil. In December 1944, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa proposed an audacious plan. As Vice Chief of the Naval General Staff and Director of the Naval War College, Ozawa had been seeking new ways to hit back at the United States after devastating carrier losses in battles like the Philippine Sea. Now, he believed he had found a solution that wouldn't require Japan's beleaguered ships to face the U.S. Navy directly, and would strike fear into the hearts of the U.S. population with a different type of attack they would never see coming. To help execute this bold assault, Ozawa turned to one of Japan's most notorious military figures, Lieutenant General Shirō Ishii. Shirō Ishii and Unit 731. Ishii was a microbiologist and Army medical officer who served as director of Unit 731, the Imperial Japanese Army's Biological Warfare Division. This feared organization operated from a massive 150-building complex in the Pingfang district of Harbin in the Japanese puppet state of Manchuria, formerly part of China, where they conducted extensive research into a range of biological and chemical weapons. Their human experimentation program was extraordinarily cruel. Subjects, mostly taken from the local population, as well as a few prisoners of war, were vivisected without anesthesia, deliberately infected with deadly diseases, and used as test subjects for weapons trials. However, of all the unit's horrific exploits, there was one in particular that caught Vice Admiral Ozawa's attention. The group had led attacks on Chinese cities such as Ningbo and Changde, not with regular weapons, but performing airstrikes using ceramic bombs packed with fleas infected with bubonic plague, the same disease that had caused the medieval Black Death, which wiped out at least a third of Europe's population. In China, the effect was devastating, not only on a physical level, but on a psychological one too. One survivor, Chiu Ming-xuan, later recalled the terror, saying, quote, "I can still remember the panic among the people. Everybody kept their doors closed and was afraid to go out. The stores were closed down, the schools were closed down." Japan's biological warfare claimed hundreds of thousands of Chinese lives, yet the sheer terror it provoked rendered it even more effective, essentially shutting society down whenever it was used. Biological war on the United States. Soon enough, the Japanese began contemplating the use of these methods against their greatest threat, the United States. In March 1942, during their invasion of the Philippines, they considered deploying 150 million plague-infected fleas in 10 separate attacks against U.S. and Filipino forces in Bataan, but the Americans surrendered the island before the plan could be carried out. Later, in the summer of 1944, another biological warfare detachment was sent to Saipan in the Mariana Islands, only to be overrun by advancing U.S. forces. Now, the Naval General Staff believed it could harness Unit 731's lethal expertise to carry out a similar attack, not in Asia or the Pacific Islands, but on major cities on the west coast of the United States. The plan. Just as in China, the Japanese intended to use aircraft to introduce bubonic plague-carrying fleas into the American population. This ambitious plan was known as Operation PX, as the Japanese used the codename PX to refer to the infected fleas, though it was also referred to by another name, Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, the deceptively peaceful imagery masking the dark truth behind the mission's objectives. Aside from loss of life, it was intended to cause widespread panic and potentially wreak havoc on the country's economy. Ozawa hoped this would significantly hinder the Allied war effort and give Japan the opportunity to gain the upper hand once more. However, such a bold move would require careful planning and an unprecedented level of technology. If the Japanese were to get close enough to the U.S. shoreline to launch an aerial biological attack, they would need to do so undetected, so that ruled out aircraft carriers. Instead, they would take advantage of the yet-to-be-completed I-400 class submarine, measuring 400 feet, longer than a football field, and displacing over 6,500 tons submerged. These underwater giants were nearly twice the size of their American counterparts. Indeed, they would remain the largest submarine ever built until the nuclear era. Though their colossal dimensions made them somewhat unwieldy to handle and slow to dive, crucially, the vessels had a range of over 40,000 miles, carrying enough fuel to circle the globe 1.5 times, more than enough to allow them to cross the entire Pacific in one go. What's more, they incorporated advanced features for the time, including a specialized trim system for remaining stationary while submerged, and an anechoic coating to help avoid sonar detection. For Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, 5 of these behemoths would stealthily make their way across the world's largest ocean. No small feat, given that the strong winds could push their large superstructures off course, and helmsmen would have to compensate for their asymmetric design by steering 7 degrees to starboard just to maintain a straight course. Inside each submarine's 100-foot-long watertight hangar, accessed through a special hydraulically operated door, would be 3 Aichi M6A Seiran floatplanes. Once the I-400 surfaced near the California coast under the cover of darkness, the crew would begin the complex 30-minute process of extracting the aircraft, unfolding their wings, and preparing them for launch, which would be performed using compressed air catapults. The aircraft's target would be San Diego, from where it was hoped the disease would spread up the coast to Los Angeles and San Francisco. However, the exact method of forcing contact with the fleas on city populations was the source of some debate. One possibility was to use bombs, as they had done in China, though there also existed a more gruesome option, instructing the pilots to deliberately crash land in the city's densely populated downtown for maximum impact. In a similar act of self-sacrifice, it was also proposed that the submarine crews should infect themselves with the plague and run ashore to transmit the disease to as many people as possible. Development and cancellation. By March 26th, the preparations for Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night were complete. However, despite the enthusiasm of the Navy General Staff for the plan, they now faced 2 major obstacles. Firstly, of the 5 I-400 submarines intended to carry out the attack, only 2, I-400 and I-401, had actually been completed. And with Japan's dwindling resources stretched further and further, the likelihood of the full 5 being finished seemed increasingly remote. Secondly, the idea was met with strong resistance from a powerful voice in the nation's military, General Yoshijirō Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff. His objection wasn't merely tactical, it was philosophical. Gravely concerned about the long-term impact of the operation, Umezu warned the Navy, quote, "If bacteriological warfare is conducted, it will grow from the dimension of war between Japan and America to an endless battle of humanity against bacteria." Japan will earn the derision of the world. Coming from such an important figure, Umezu's comments carried significant weight. Soon after the plans were finalized, the operation was shelved. Yet, it wasn't the definitive end of the road for Ozawa and Ishii's bold plan quite yet. As Japan's war situation deteriorated dramatically through the summer of 1945, there was renewed interest in the plan. Allied forces were now within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. Cities across Japan were being devastated by relentless bombing raids, and what remained of the once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. In these desperate circumstances, even Umezu began reconsidering his earlier opposition to biological warfare, contemplating its use as a last-ditch effort to keep Japan in the war. However, by that time, only one further I-400 had been completed. More importantly, it had been converted during construction to serve as a tanker submarine instead. On August 15, 1945, after being hit by 2 nuclear bombs, Japan finally announced its surrender. But even then, Lieutenant General Ishii still wasn't ready to abandon his biological weapons. He proposed one final operation. It would involve him leading a Japanese force in an act of self-sacrifice, infecting themselves with diseases before spreading them among Allied occupation forces entering Japan. Yet once again, Umezu and his colleague, General Torishiro Kawabe, stood in opposition. This time, rather than risk Ishii losing his life, they asked him to, quote, wait for the next opportunity calmly. Conclusion and legacy. While Ishii's moment to launch another biological attack would never come, he was given a second chance of a very different kind. Despite being responsible for enormous loss of life through his work at Unit 731, he was granted immunity from prosecution by the United States in exchange for his research data. A team of American military microbiologists, led by Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, considered the information he had gleaned from his sadistic studies to be extremely valuable, commenting in their report that it could, quote, never have been obtained in the United States because of scruples attached to experiments on humans. Ishii would later lecture American officers at Fort Detrick about biological weapons. Vice Admiral Ozawa, who had led the planning of the operation, also escaped punishment after the war. He would go on to serve as an advisor for the Japanese Defense Agency, living until 1966. Meanwhile, perhaps somewhat ironically, General Umezu, the man in grand part responsible for putting the brakes on Ishii and Ozawa's plans and stopping the war from reaching a biological phase, was arrested by Allied occupation authorities and tried as a war criminal at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. Found guilty of waging aggressive war, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, eventually succumbing to rectal cancer in 1949 while still incarcerated. As for the massive I-400 submarines designed to carry out the attack, they were captured by U.S. forces after Japan's surrender. After studying them carefully, the Americans realized the advanced technology they featured. Determined to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands and being used against them in the nascent Cold War, they deliberately sank them. The wreck of I-400 would not be discovered until 2013, found off the coast of Hawaii, a silent testament to the terrible Japanese plan that almost changed the face of World War II.